Okay, so hopefully it's visible. Wonderful. So welcome back, everyone. And for today, I'd love to explore the topic of boundaries and how boundaries could be a great practice to help release us from stress, from suffering. So each of us has our own optimal mode of operation. What Barry Allen referred to insightfully before as our window of tolerance. And this is where we're feeling, in our element. We're in the zone, we're with the flow, we're feeling energized, happy, and fulfilled. And when we're pushed past our natural limits and personal capabilities, we're likely to feel tired, stressed, and overwhelmed. We might experience exhaustion and frustration, feeling that we have to be available to attend to everyone's needs, what's often known as compassion fatigue. We might feel like we're giving away our energy, time, power, and love to others, with virtually nothing left for ourselves. And this is a sign that our own needs are not being met and is an experience of suffering or unhappiness, what the Buddha calls dukkha in Pali. So we can look to the times in our lives where poorly defined or inappropriate boundaries have been a cause of much stress and suffering, whether through overworking ourselves to the point of burnout, dealing with relationships that drain us, or managing all these negative effects on our health. So when we're thinking about boundaries, we might be asking, isn't this a contradiction? Aren't we supposed to be focused on selflessness, oneness, and non-separateness? Aren't we supposed to be opening ourselves up to others? And don't boundaries create separation from others? Actually, as we'll find out, boundary setting is an essential practice for well-being and is actually a core element of our practice. So in using the teachings of the Buddha as an example, in this context, a mind that is uncontrolled, untrained, and unaware is a source of suffering. A mind that's wandering about, attaching to thoughts of the past and to the future, and one that's not present with awareness in this moment tends to produce feelings of regret, sadness, worry, a sense of restlessness, fear, and anxiety. So this is why training and developing the mind towards peaceful and clear states of mind is at the core in Buddhist practice. And here we see the experience of boundaries taking many shapes and forms. When we think about it in terms of boundaries, we see the practice of ethical living, known as sila, as taught by the Buddha, to be a very clear practice of setting boundaries. We make the choice to abstain from all things that cause ourselves and others suffering and harm. So our minds are very, very porous as well. They're soaking up like big sponges, whatever comes through, our senses. That could be the news, other people's strong emotions, pleasant, nice things that attract our senses. So through mindfulness, we take care of limiting and filtering what comes through the senses and affects us within. In Buddhist practice, too, a very important teaching is not associating with fools, but associating with the wise. This is about being discerning about who we spend our time with, knowing that they'll influence the way we think and behave. Also, a natural boundary within which we find ourselves is the very fact that our existence is conditioned by various causes and conditions. We have to live with the fact that our existence as human beings brings with it inherent limits. We're not perfect. So we have limits due to our not knowing, our misunderstandings, our delusion as individuals and as a collective. So I just wanted to highlight a few of the Buddha's teachings, because there's a common misconception that Buddhist practice teaches us to be a doormat, saying yes to everything, letting everyone run all over us. And yet when we look closer, we see that this can be quite far from the truth. In order to achieve freedom from stress and suffering, there are many times and many teachings where the Buddha advocated for what we would consider to be boundaries. And two specific examples include the first being, or one of them being, disregarding, someone we feel resentment for and not paying attention to that person. So this is one of 5 ways of removing resentment that arises within us, and he goes on to say, we should develop loving kindness towards this person, compassion, equanimity for the person we resent, and then also, not pay them any attention, because we know that when we think about that person we don't really like, it brings up negative feelings within us. So actually not associating with that person is a recommended way of dealing with resentment as well. In addition to the idea that whatever that person does, they'll have to deal with their own consequences of that. The second example is when the Buddha rejected abuse. He recounts a time when a Brahmin comes at him and insults him. And this person's just spewing all these things at him. And so the Buddha asks him, if you offer someone a gift, but they don't accept it, who does the gift belong to? So this Brahmin says, well, if they don't accept it, it belongs to me. So the Buddha says, so too, Brahmin, I don't abuse anyone, do not scold anyone, do not rail against anyone. I refuse to accept from you the abuse and scolding and tirade you let loose at me. So it still belongs to you, Brahmin. It still belongs to you. In fact, we could interpret this practice and path of the middle way as an expression of boundaries, right? Not taking to any extremes, being bounded by extremes on each end. And these extremes could take the form of, let's say, saying yes all the time on the one hand, saying no all the time on the other hand. We can consider this to be a training in balance, saying both yes and no, right? Saying yes to that which relieves suffering and stress, saying no to that which increases and contributes to more stress and suffering. So having boundaries guides us to what actually nourishes us, keeping us on the path of peace. I also wanted to highlight this very important teaching. Well, one that has been very impactful for me is this teaching of considering who we're practicing for. So here the Buddha pointed out that there's 4 kinds of practitioners in the world. One of them being someone who doesn't practice for their own welfare nor the welfare of others. Next, someone practicing for the welfare of others, but not for their own welfare. Third, someone who's practicing for their own welfare, but not the welfare of others. And lastly, someone practicing for both their own welfare and the welfare of others. And of these 4, he praises the last one, the one practicing for both their own welfare and the welfare of others, as the foremost, the finest of these 4 persons. But what's really interesting to me to note is that the Buddha also considered person number 3, the person practicing for their own welfare, but not the welfare of others, to rank higher, to be better than the person just practicing for other people's welfare and not their own. And this is the same concept as putting on our own oxygen mask first in an airplane. Right? When we take care of ourselves first, we're better equipped to take care then of others. So we have, likely a noble intention of wanting to be helpful and of service to others, to reduce suffering in this world. But when we find ourselves stressed, overwhelmed, unhappy, or run ragged, interacting and caring for others, it's often a big sign that we're lacking in proper boundaries for self-care. We're running up against the limits of our own resources and have sacrificed our own needs for the needs of others, by not taking care of ourselves and taking care of others first. And so a noble task is to wisely figure out what will and will not be of benefit to all beings. And all beings includes ourselves. We often cut that one out or forget to include that. So what at first seems to be a paradox between separateness through boundaries and this idea of interconnection and non-separateness can be understood when we look at our intention versus our reality. So we can work towards developing a heart of boundless compassion and connection within the limits of our conditioned existence, within the various circumstances we find ourselves in. We can develop that intention of living with kindness and care and openness to all beings as we're working with our current reality, where the forces of greed, hatred, and ignorance, delusion, are still actively in play. Boundaries allow us to move towards peaceful practices in a world where we're not perfect, where we ourselves and others are interacting with one another with desire, with dislike or anger with misunderstanding and confusion. I mean, in a perfect world where we're all enlightened beings with pure hearts and minds, where we're interacting harmoniously at all times in all activities, living in a system that promotes peace and harmony, we probably wouldn't need boundaries. But in our current existence, boundaries allow us to more skillfully navigate the world under these limiting conditions, all while we move with intention towards peace and boundless compassion towards all beings. What's important here, though, is to examine where we're coming from. So in this context, we're talking about setting boundaries that are generative, that allow us to grow, allow for clarity and compassion to develop. And not so much the defensive type of boundaries, which we might be more used to hearing about, where we protect ourselves from life, where we're closing ourselves up, cutting people off or keeping people at a distance with a sense of maybe fear or separateness. In contrast, we're setting boundaries with strength and clarity, connecting to that which serves us, not with anger nor hate, but with wise boundaries that allow us to create a structure where we can embody our deepest values. And this requires compassionate awareness. It's a process of learning to recognize our limits with compassion. We're being aware in a kind way, our own current capabilities and resources, such as our knowledge, time, energy, material resources, and inner resources. And recognizing that in others too, like those current capabilities and resources and their limits, and then acting accordingly. So with proper boundaries, we're better able to attend to our own needs. Through that, we experience greater peace, ease, and spaciousness. We cultivate a resiliency and a greater capacity for care and compassion. When we set boundaries that are appropriate to our needs and current resources, we're actually living wisely and having a proper understanding of reality. Because we're working on understanding things as they actually are, and understanding the conditions we find ourselves in. And that brings us into greater alignment with reality. And that's where perhaps we start to feel a sense of flow, like we're not resisting, but we're working with. So in order to set up appropriate boundaries, we need to have first a clear understanding of what it is we actually need and value. Right? To create boundaries for ourselves, we have to tune in to our personal needs and true feelings. The practice of meditation and mindfulness is key here. And another useful tool to help us identify our needs is Marshall Rosenthal's nonviolent communication framework, which outlines universal needs that each of us have as human beings. I recently had an experience where I realized I needed boundaries. And I started to understand that I needed long stretches of unscheduled time where I could be free to think and work. Because I was at a point where I was so over, kind of everything was scheduled. I felt very stressed, overwhelmed, and all over the place, feeling like I was always pressed for time. And I needed a sense of freedom where there wasn't any upcoming meetings I had to prepare for. And so I actually had to do a very deliberate reflection on what it is I actually needed, and then brainstorm healthier ways of meeting those needs. And through this was an example where I was able to find that spaciousness by setting boundaries. So, to set wise boundaries, we also need to become friends with no. This word that we often associate with being rude or unkind, but actually, we can consider to be our friends. When we're saying no, we're allowing ourselves more opportunities for things we truly care about and need. So, meeting our needs and doing what's right for us at this time isn't selfish. It's not rude, it's just saying no. And saying no also allows others to understand our priorities. It makes known to others what our current capabilities and limits are, and prevents us from creating conditions that lead us towards resentment. For example, we might be saying yes to others, but our heart is saying no and feeling resentment or guilt for it. So, in fact, saying no is an act of kindness that we extend to ourselves and others. Also, in setting wise boundaries, we need to have a clear understanding of what it is that we do have control over and what we don't have control over. So, some things that are within our control include who we decide to spend our time with, it's our own self care, it's what we watch on TV and look at online. So, we have influence over that. Some things that are out of our control or we have very limited control over include how others react, what others say. When we set up our own boundaries, what's out of our control is how people react to our boundaries, or their feelings. Knowing also that, okay, if we're setting boundaries, how people feel about that, we can't control that. But we can stay grounded in the things that are within our control and focus our efforts there. Because we know that we're doing it for a good cause and one that will ultimately benefit the other as well. So the more we can tune into ourselves, the more we can understand our true feelings and the things we can and can't control, it becomes easier to set and maintain boundaries in whatever situation. Recognizing too that boundaries are a work in progress, not something that we do once and then it's over. Because life and the people around us are constantly changing. And so we'll need to keep managing our boundaries as circumstances change. So ultimately, setting boundaries is an act of kindness and compassion that we extend to ourselves and to others. In doing so, we free ourselves from mental, emotional and physical stress, anguish, and suffering. We allow ourselves the ability to recharge our batteries by focusing on that which nourishes us, and we develop greater inner resources. And all of this allow us to come back stronger and more capable of carrying out our noble intention of practicing for the betterment and the well-being of all beings, ourselves included. And in this way, perhaps we can understand boundaries to be an essential part of our practice for well-being that releases us from stress and suffering, allows us to grow, and move us towards freedom. And so with this, I'd love to pass it over to Phil for any questions any of you might have.